Some babies are just burdens, Linda Carter said, her voice light, almost thoughtful, as she reached for the salt across the oak dining table, and the word burdens lingered in the air like something sour no one wanted to claim. And across from her, Emily Carter adjusted the soft pink blanket around 8-month-old Sophie, without looking up, her movements slow and careful, as if precision alone could keep her composure intact, while Robert Carter cleared his throat and stared at his plate. The overhead light casting sharp shadows across the framed family photos lining the wall behind him. Photos that told a story of graduations, Christmas mornings, and beach trips to Cape Cod, all of them suggesting unity, none of them revealing the quiet imbalance that had been shaping this family for nearly 2 years. Emily had arrived that evening with a diaper bag over one shoulder and a container of homemade chicken casserole balanced in her free hand, the same way she had every Sunday since. Sophie was born because tradition mattered to her, because stability mattered, because she believed that even small rituals could hold a family together. And yet tonight something felt different. The air cooler, the smiles thinner, the conversation edged with commentary about daycare costs and grocery prices and how young couples these days never seemed financially prepared. Emily did not respond when her mother continued. It must be exhausting, all those expenses, or when her father added, diapers alone cost a fortune, spoken with a faint shake of his head, as though Sophie were an unexpected invoice rather than a child with bright blue eyes and a laugh that filled rooms. What neither of them knew, what they had never once thought to question, was that the electricity warming this house in early March, the property tax bill paid last September, and the monthly mortgage draft that cleared on the 1st of every month had not come from Robert's modest pension or Linda's dwindling savings, but from Emily's quiet transfers, set up 18 months ago when her father mentioned over coffee that they were a little behind, a phrase he delivered casually while stirring artificial sweetener into his cup, unaware that Emily would go home that afternoon, open her laptop at the small desk tucked into the corner of her apartment living room, and schedule automatic payments that would keep this household afloat. She had never announced it, never sought gratitude, because to her it was simple. Family helps family. But sitting at that table now, hearing her child reduced to a burden, something inside her shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the steady clarity of someone finally seeing a pattern in plain sight. Sophie cooed softly, reaching for the edge of the tablecloth, and Emily lifted her into her arms, pressing a gentle kiss to her daughter's temple, her expression composed, almost serene, as she listened to her parents discuss budgeting and responsibility as if they were lecturing a reckless teenager instead of the woman who had been carrying far more than they realized. Outside, the late winter wind rattled the bare branches against the siding, and inside, the clock above the stove ticked with quiet persistence, marking time in a house sustained by a truth that had yet to surface, a truth that would soon redraw every assumption they had made about who, exactly, was the burden in this family. Emily drove home that night with both hands steady on the steering wheel, the highway lights stretching in long yellow lines ahead of her, while Sophie slept in the back seat, her small breath soft and rhythmic against the hum of the car. And for the first time since her daughter was born, Emily allowed herself to replay every comment, every subtle sigh, every raised eyebrow her parents had offered over the past year. It had started quietly, almost politely, with questions about how much formula cost per month and whether working from home was truly sustainable, then shifted into suggestions that perhaps she should consider moving back into her childhood bedroom to save money. A proposal delivered with the gentle tone of generosity, but layered with the implication that she could not manage on her own. What Robert and Linda never understood was that Emily had never struggled the way they imagined. She had simply chosen not to advertise her stability, because independence had always been something she proved through action rather than announcement. When Sophie was 3 months old, and the pediatrician recommended a specific hypoallergenic formula that cost nearly $50 per can, Emily adjusted her budget without complaint, cutting back on streaming subscriptions and cooking at home instead of ordering takeout. And when daycare waitlists stretched for months, she rearranged her freelance design clients into evening hours, working at the small kitchen table after Sophie had fallen asleep, her laptop casting a pale glow across the quiet apartment. Meanwhile, each first of the month, her phone would vibrate gently with a notification confirming that $1,280 had cleared toward her parents' mortgage, followed by smaller automatic drafts for utilities and homeowner insurance. Payments she had set up the week she discovered that Robert had taken an early withdrawal from his retirement account to cover overdue property taxes. She remembered that afternoon clearly, the way her father had laughed it off, saying it was just temporary. The market would recover, everything would be fine, and Emily had nodded, then gone home and opened her banking application with the calm resolve of someone who does not wait for things to fall apart. She never mentioned the transfers during Sunday dinners, never corrected her mother when Linda spoke proudly about keeping the lights on without asking for help, because part of her believed that dignity mattered, that preserving their sense of control was an act of kindness. Yet as she lifted Sophie from her car seat and carried her into the apartment that night, the weight of her daughter felt lighter than the words she had heard at that table. And standing in the soft lamplight of her living room, Emily realized that her silence had protected more than her parents' pride. It had also allowed a narrative to grow unchecked, a story in which she was fragile, overwhelmed, dependent, and that story no longer matched the truth she was living. The following Sunday arrived with a thin layer of frost still clinging to the lawns in Robert and Linda's neighborhood, and Emily stood in her kitchen that morning spooning mashed sweet potatoes into small glass containers for Sophie, moving with the calm efficiency she had learned over months of doing everything herself, while her mind replayed moments she had once dismissed as harmless. There had been the afternoon Linda suggested that perhaps Emily should sell her car and use ride-share services instead, because single-income mothers need to be practical. Even though Emily had purchased that car outright 2 years earlier after saving carefully for a dependable vehicle with low mileage and strong safety ratings, there had been the time Robert offered to review her budget, leaning back in his recliner as if he were still the head of household, unaware that the online banking notifications confirming his mortgage payment came from his daughter's account. Emily remembered each comment now with startling clarity, like puzzle pieces sliding into place, revealing a pattern she could no longer ignore. At dinner that evening, the table was set with Linda's floral plates and cloth napkins ironed flat, and Sophie sat in a small portable high chair, tapping a plastic spoon against the tray while Robert discussed rising interest rates and how young families often underestimate the cost of raising children. "You have to think long-term," he said, pointing his fork gently in Emily's direction. "College funds, medical expenses, emergencies." And Emily nodded, her expression neutral, because she had already opened a $500 monthly college savings plan the week Sophie was born, and she had built an emergency fund that covered 6 months of living expenses, and she had never once missed a single payment on her own rent. Linda leaned forward, lowering her voice slightly as though offering wisdom, and said that sometimes love means making hard choices, that not everyone is meant to take on the responsibility of parenthood without support. And the word support hung between them, heavy with implication. Emily glanced at the framed certificate on the wall celebrating her father's retirement from the accounting firm where he had worked for 35 years, and she wondered how someone so skilled with numbers could fail to see the arithmetic unfolding in his own home. Sophie squealed softly and reached for her mother, and Emily lifted her, settling the child against her shoulder, feeling the steady warmth of her daughter's small body. She realized then that her parents were not intentionally cruel, but they were comfortable in a version of reality that placed them above her, wiser, stronger, more capable. And that comfort had been sustained by her silence. As the clock ticked past 8 in the evening and the conversation drifted toward grocery prices and fuel costs per gallon, Emily understood that what they saw as guidance was rooted in an assumption that she was barely managing. And what they did not see was the quiet strength that had been underwriting their stability month after month. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply observed. And in that observation something firm and resolute began to take shape inside her. Not anger, not resentment, but clarity, the kind that comes when a person finally understands exactly where they stand. On Tuesday afternoon, while Sophie napped in her crib and a thin stripe of sunlight stretched across the living room carpet, Emily sat at her small wooden desk and opened the folder on her laptop labeled Household Transfers, a name she had chosen deliberately neutral, as though the simplicity of it might keep the arrangement from feeling as significant as it truly was. She scrolled through the statements slowly, watching the dates pass in orderly rows, 18 consecutive months of payments that had quietly stabilized her parents' finances, each entry accompanied by a confirmation number and the same steady amount drafted from her checking account. And as she reviewed them, she remembered the first time she had noticed the warning signs, the way Linda's voice had tightened over the phone when she mentioned a late notice from the utility company, the way Robert had brushed aside questions about the market downturn affecting his retirement investments. Emily had not confronted them. Then, had not asked for spreadsheets or explanations. She had simply logged into her banking application and set the transfers in motion, calculating what she could comfortably afford after rent, groceries, health insurance premiums, and the modest but consistent contributions she made to Sophie's future. She had adjusted her freelance rates slightly upward that spring, taken on 2 additional branding projects, and organized her calendar with careful precision, balancing client calls during Sophie's afternoon naps and design revisions after midnight when the apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. She had never felt resentful about the extra work, because responsibility had always felt more natural to her than complaint. Yet as she studied the numbers now, she realized how thoroughly she had protected her parents from the discomfort of acknowledging their dependence. The following weekend, when she arrived at their house carrying a reusable grocery bag filled with fresh produce she had picked up at a local farmer's market, she noticed a new tone in Linda's voice as her mother discussed an upcoming home improvement project, casually mentioning plans to repaint the guest bedroom and replace the aging water heater. Speaking as though the household budget were expansive and secure, Robert chimed in with a story about a friend who had downsized to a condominium, shaking his head at the idea and declaring that he preferred stability. And Emily listened carefully, absorbing each word without interruption, because she understood now that their confidence rested on a foundation they did not see. Sophie sat on the living room rug stacking soft fabric blocks, her laughter rising and falling like a bright note against the background of adult conversation. And Emily watched her daughter with a quiet resolve settling deeper inside her, a recognition that transparency and dignity were not opposites but partners, and that the balance she had maintained through silence might soon require a different kind of strength, not loud or dramatic, but firm enough to withstand whatever truth emerged once the numbers were finally spoken aloud. 2 evenings later, the tension that had been quietly building finally surfaced in the most ordinary way. Over a cup of decaffeinated coffee at the Carter kitchen table, while Sophie sat in her stroller beside Emily, chewing on a soft silicone teether and watching the ceiling fan spin, Linda had just finished describing a weekend getaway she and Robert were considering, a small bed and breakfast 2 hours north near the lake, complete with antique shops and scenic walking trails, and she laughed lightly as she said they deserved a break after all the financial pressure lately, a phrase that made Emily pause mid-sip. Robert nodded in agreement and added that managing a household in retirement required discipline, especially when adult children made choices that strained family resources. And although he did not look directly at Emily, the implication settled heavily in the space between them. Emily placed her mug down carefully on its saucer, the porcelain clicking softly against the wood, and she glanced at Sophie, who responded with a bright, trusting smile, unaware of the undercurrent flowing through the room. Emily had spent the previous night reviewing her accounts again, not out of doubt, but out of clarity, confirming the exact figures she had transferred since that first quiet decision 18 months ago, and she knew the total down to the dollar, knew how many gallons of gas she had skipped, how many new clothes she had postponed buying for herself, how many late nights she had worked to make the math hold steady. Financial pressure can feel heavy, Emily said evenly, her voice calm and measured, and both of her parents turned toward her, perhaps expecting another polite nod or quiet agreement. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper she had printed that morning, a summary of the recurring transfers, neatly organized by date and amount, and she slid it across the table without dramatic flourish. Robert adjusted his reading glasses and leaned forward, his expression shifting gradually from mild curiosity to something far more sobering as his eyes moved down the column of numbers. Linda blinked twice, her smile fading as recognition began to take shape. I thought it might help to clarify where the pressure has actually been. Emily continued, her tone steady, neither accusatory nor apologetic. The room grew still except for the faint whir of the refrigerator and the gentle rustle of Sophie's blanket as she kicked her feet. Robert cleared his throat, but no immediate explanation followed, because the evidence did not invite easy reinterpretation. The dates matched their mortgage statements, the amounts aligned with their utility bills, and the realization settled gradually, undeniable and complete. Emily did not raise her voice, did not recount every comment that had led to this moment. She simply allowed the silence to do what it does best when truth is placed squarely in the center of the table. Outside, a delivery truck rolled slowly past the house, its engine humming steadily, while inside, the balance of assumption and reality shifted in a way that could not be undone. Robert read the page twice before he set it down, and the second time his hands were not as steady as they had been when he first picked it up, because the numbers did not leave room for interpretation. They did not soften themselves to protect pride. They simply existed in black ink against white paper, month after month, amount after amount, and Linda leaned closer to him, her shoulder nearly touching his as she followed the same columns, her lips parting slightly, as if she were about to speak, but no words forming. Emily remained seated, her back straight, her hands folded loosely in her lap, not defensive, not triumphant, simply present, while Sophie shifted in her stroller and let out a small, contented sound that felt almost out of place in the heavy quiet. "You have been sending this every month," Robert finally said, his voice lower than usual, more measured, as though each syllable required careful selection, and Emily nodded once, because confirmation did not require elaboration. Linda blinked and glanced toward the kitchen counter where a stack of unopened mail sat beside a ceramic fruit bowl, and in that glance was a flicker of recognition, a memory of the relief she had felt each time a due date passed without consequence, each time the light stayed on, each time the mortgage statement showed zero balance owed. "Why did you not say anything?" Linda asked, her tone no longer instructional but uncertain. And Emily answered quietly that she did not believe support should be used as leverage, that she assumed they would tell her if they wanted to handle it differently, and that she had never intended to embarrass them. The clock above the microwave ticked steadily, marking the seconds in a room that felt altered in a way none of them could ignore, and Robert leaned back in his chair, removing his glasses and pressing his fingers briefly against the bridge of his nose, as if recalibrating his understanding of the past year. "We thought you were struggling," he admitted, the admission soft but unmistakable, and Emily met his gaze without accusation, because what mattered was not the apology she might receive, but the clarity that now existed between them. She reached into her bag once more and pulled out her phone, opening her banking application and turning the screen so they could see the recurring transfers still scheduled for the 1st of next month, the green confirmation icon, glowing quietly. "I set them up because I could," she said, her voice steady, "and because I wanted you to feel secure." And Linda's eyes filled not with dramatic emotion, but with a dawning awareness of the narrative she had unknowingly repeated, the assumptions she had voiced about burden and responsibility. Sophie kicked her legs again, brushing the edge of the tablecloth with her tiny socked foot, and Emily gently steadied the stroller, her movements calm, deliberate, as if to demonstrate that the strength they had underestimated was not loud or forceful but consistent, reliable, and now undeniably visible. The silence that followed did not break quickly, because some realizations require time to settle into the bones, and Robert remained seated with the paper still in front of him, his thumb resting along the edge as if he were steadying more than just a page, while Linda folded her hands together on the table, her posture no longer composed in quiet authority but drawn inward, reflective. Emily did not rush to fill the space. She did not recite every instance that had led to this moment, because the numbers had already spoken clearly, and what remained was not proof but perspective. "We never meant to make you feel small," Linda said at last, her voice softer than it had been in years, and Emily listened without interrupting, because this was not about assigning guilt but about restoring balance. Robert nodded slowly and admitted that he had assumed his daughter needed guidance, that he had viewed her life through the lens of his own experience, believing that retirement equaled wisdom and youth equaled instability, and as he spoke, The certainty that had once framed his advice seemed to loosen. Sophie reached out with one hand toward the edge of the table, her fingers stretching curiously toward the sheet of paper that had altered the room, and Emily gently caught her tiny hand, brushing her thumb across her daughter's knuckles in a quiet gesture of reassurance. "I never wanted you to feel dependent," Emily said calmly, choosing her words with care. "And I never wanted my child to be described as something that weighs anyone down." And there was no sharpness in her tone, only clarity, the kind that does not waver once it has been earned. Linda lowered her gaze, and in that small movement was an understanding that the narrative she had repeated so casually had consequences beyond her intention. Outside, a breeze moved through the trees, sending a faint tapping sound against the window, and inside, the air felt less heavy, not because everything had been resolved, but because truth had replaced assumption. Robert finally pushed the paper back toward Emily and said that he would speak with their financial advisor the following week, that they would reassess their expenses and take responsibility for their household without quiet assistance. And the admission was not dramatic, but it carried weight. Emily nodded once, not out of triumph but acknowledgement, because independence was not something she demanded loudly. It was something she lived steadily. When she stood to gather her bag and lift Sophie from the stroller, neither of her parents stopped her, but both rose as well, their expressions altered in a way that could not be undone. The hierarchy they had relied upon shifted into something more equal. As Emily stepped onto the front porch, the late afternoon light cast a warm glow across the driveway, and she adjusted Sophie against her shoulder, feeling the familiar rhythm of her daughter's breathing, knowing that the quiet strength she carried had finally been seen, not because she had shouted, but because she had chosen the precise moment to let the truth stand on its own. The next morning, Emily woke before sunrise, the apartment still wrapped in the soft gray quiet that comes just before the city begins to stir, and she lay still for a moment listening to Sophie's gentle breathing through the baby monitor, steady and peaceful, a small reminder of what truly required her energy. She rose carefully, brewed a cup of coffee, and sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open, not out of urgency, but intention, because clarity once revealed demands thoughtful action. She logged into her banking application and navigated to the recurring transfers, her finger hovering briefly over the scheduled payment set for the first of the month, and she did not hesitate long. She simply adjusted the setting from automatic to manual, not as punishment, not as retaliation, but as restoration of proper boundaries. The confirmation message appeared in calm blue text, informing her that future payments would no longer process without her approval, and she exhaled slowly, feeling not anger but relief, as if a weight she had carried quietly for nearly 2 years had shifted back into appropriate hands. Later that week, Robert called in the early evening, his voice measured and subdued, explaining that he and Linda had met with their financial advisor and were restructuring their budget, that they had not realized how much they had leaned on what they assumed was temporary assistance. And Emily listened with the same composed patience she had shown at the kitchen table, acknowledging his words without dramatizing them. She did not recount past comments, did not revisit the sting of that single sentence that had sparked everything, because the correction had already occurred. Instead, she spoke about practical matters, about interest rates, about refinancing options, about reducing discretionary expenses, her tone even and collaborative, reflecting the equality that now existed between them. On Sunday, when she arrived for dinner, the atmosphere felt altered, not tense but recalibrated, and Linda greeted her at the door with a softness that had previously been masked by instruction. Sophie was passed from grandparent to grandparent with genuine delight, her laughter filling the living room as she grasped at Robert's glasses and squealed with curiosity, and no one used the language of burden or strain. Conversation shifted toward shared responsibility and mutual respect. And when Linda mentioned that they had decided to postpone their weekend getaway until their finances were fully stabilized, she did so without defensiveness, as though acknowledging reality rather than protecting pride. Emily observed the change quietly, aware that transformation is rarely loud. It unfolds in subtle choices, in altered tones, in the absence of old assumptions. As the evening light filtered through the curtains and cast long shadows across the hardwood floor, Emily felt a steadiness settle inside her, not triumph, not vindication, but balance, the kind that allows love to exist without hierarchy. When she gathered Sophie into her arms and prepared to leave, her parents walked her to the door, and Robert paused before she stepped outside, saying simply that he was proud of the woman she had become, and this time the statement carried no hidden comparison, no implied correction, only recognition. Emily nodded once, holding her daughter close, understanding that respect had not been demanded through force. It had been earned through quiet strength, and that's sometimes the most powerful. Shift in a family is not who speaks the loudest, but who chooses the exact moment to let the truth stand and then calmly reshape the future around it. Several months later, the rhythm of Emily's life felt steady in a way it had not before, not because circumstances had become easier, but because clarity had replaced uncertainty. And on a bright Saturday morning in early summer, she sat on a park bench watching Sophie attempt her first unsteady steps across the soft grass, her tiny sneakers sinking slightly into the ground as she wobbled forward with determined concentration. Robert and Linda stood a few feet away, their hands instinctively hovering but not interfering, their encouragement gentle and free of commentary. And when Sophie stumbled and landed softly on her diapered bottom, laughter followed instead of anxious instruction. Emily observed the scene quietly, recognizing the subtle shift that had unfolded over the past weeks, the way her parents now asked rather than advised, the way conversations centered on shared plans instead of cautionary warnings. And she understood that respect, once recalibrated, carries a different tone. The financial transfers no longer moved automatically from her account, and Robert had taken on consulting work 2 days a week to supplement his retirement income, a choice he described not with embarrassment but with renewed purpose. While Linda had organized their expenses with practical determination, trimming subscriptions and postponing renovations without resentment. At Sunday dinners, topics drifted toward Sophie's milestones, toward Emily's design projects, toward small stories of neighborhood happenings, and the word responsibility no longer carried an accusatory edge. One evening, as golden light filtered through the kitchen window and cast a warm glow across the countertop, Linda handed Emily a handwritten note, a simple acknowledgement of gratitude for the months of support. Not dramatic, not embellished, but sincere, and Emily accepted it with a quiet nod, because recognition does not require spectacle to matter. Later that night, after Sophie had fallen asleep in her crib and the apartment lights were dimmed, Emily stood by the window and looked out at the city skyline in the distance, reflecting on how easily narratives can take root when silence fills the gaps, and how deliberately they must be corrected once truth surfaces. She did not regret the assistance she had given, because generosity had been her choice, but she no longer carried the weight of unspoken imbalance. Sophie stirred softly in her sleep, and Emily walked to the nursery, adjusting the blanket with careful hands, feeling the steady warmth of her daughter's small body and understanding with certainty that strength is not defined by volume or confrontation, but by consistency and clarity. When she returned to the living room and turned off the final lamp, the apartment settled into peaceful darkness, and in that quiet she recognized that the greatest shift had not been financial at all. It had been relational, a movement from assumption to respect, from hierarchy to partnership. And as the night deepened and the city outside continued its distant hum, Emily knew that the foundation she was building for her child would rest not on obligation or silent sacrifice, but on boundaries set with calm confidence and love grounded in mutual regard.